Welcome to the Military Transition Academy's PM Pathfinder series, where Max Rogers, former enlisted Marine turned naval officer and civilian energy industry project manager extraordinaire, teams up with the former Navy enlisted and Army officer candidate Eric Doc Wright, Vesta PM's founder and best-selling author, alongside Jeremy Burdick, a retired Air Force chief, aircraft mechanic and aviator turned civilian operations chief and process specialist for Vesta PM and the PDU University, bring you an audio-video suite to help you find the path while mentoring you in the profession of project management. Along the way, you can study for your CAPM, PMP, PMI-ACP, Scrum Master certifications, or just maintain your professional development units in a casual, enjoyable conversation between friends. Back for another episode of the PM Pathfinder with Max, and we're going to cover a lot of ground today. I think it's like 5 or 6 topics, starting with the logical units of iterations, interpreting the pros and cons of those iterations, translating a WBS into an adaptive iteration. So we're going to take a predictive artifact and try to convert it into an adaptive, I guess, really more of a plan, if you will, or a flow. And then we're going to determine inputs for scope and then explain the importance of adaptive project tracking versus predictive plan-based tracking. So lots to cover, but they all should mesh and blend pretty well. So it's a fairly contiguous conversation all the way through. So let's just start off with iterations. What are logical units of iterations, or what are iterations to you, Max?
Well, once again, it's project dependent and content environment dependent. But on a adaptive project, whatever time, the agile principles, say that, give a guideline of 2 weeks to 2 months with a preference toward shorter time frame. If your, XP strictly focuses on 1 week iteration. So it depends on the environment you're in, the company you're with, and what type of methodology you're using. But I think the most important thing is to focus on what makes sense for the project you're doing. How much work are you trying to get accomplished for, each iteration to deliver to the customer? And I think that will change with time. If you're working on a project that's very time sensitive to get to market, and the customer is very focused on being the first to market, then you want to have shorter iterations and show them produce the value you can, even though you may feel that the iteration may be so short that you can't fully produce the value you need. The customer, once again, is the one that's driving this, and his focus is on speed to market. So you use shorter iterations for them. If there's not a focus or a risk on time to market, then maybe longer iterations would make sense based on how much work you're trying to get done. What does that product roadmap look like? How many releases do you have planned? And can you line up perhaps by extending the length of your iteration by just a few days or by a week? You can line up the iterations with the releases, which just makes good sense, or keeps things simpler, because at the end of every iteration you're having a release, and instead of having several iterations and then a release and then a couple of more iterations and then a release. So it can simplify things that way. But the bottom line is it's project dependent, it's customer preference, it's what you're trying to do, all in. You have to look at the entire context of the project and what is the environment that you find yourself in. So,
perfect. Yeah, I love it. There's a couple things you said in there that I want to bring out to the group here that's listening. Is if you're doing a sprint, you're probably using Scrum, right? Like that is a specific word.
Yep.
If not, you're probably calling it an iteration, but ultimately it's a time box, right? So there's a scale. You start something, you end something, and whether you call it 1 week or a month, ultimately you have a start stop. And so you pointed that out. I think that's really important to say, because you can even have iterations on a predictive project where you work and you release, and then you basically phase gate stuff. So you can think of it that way. And you said it really well with, it really depends on one, the project, two, the stakeholders, and three, the customer. So if you're trying to deliver value really quickly, shorter iterations, probably let them see the value, make quick corrections, and then release something of value to market. So like if you're first to market, it doesn't have to be a fully baked cake. Maybe you put out a cupcake, right? And you're starting to get the customers interested in your project or interested in your product in a sense of the first movers out in the world. So really well said. I mean, honestly, I think that kind of covers it. Logical units can be broken down into, hours, days, weeks, months. So I think what the real big thing here is the time boxing. It's got a set time box.
And just make sure that you have all your ceremonies. You have that iteration planning session, you have your daily stand-ups, then at the end you have your iteration review, and then you do your iteration retrospective. So that's the most important thing, is that you go through the agile methodology of those ceremonies, and to maintain the agile principles.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect. So that really takes us to the pros and cons. Like, what's some of the pros to, and we touched on some of them, the pros to an iteration?
Mm-hmm. Well, like you just said, you time box the iteration. So therefore, it fixes the schedule, but it releases the scope. If you're gonna time box an iteration at 2 weeks, based on the team's velocity, there's only so much work they can do in that two-week period. And if that's sufficient, once again, with a focus on adding value to the customer. And that's the thing that separates adaptive type methodologies from predictive type methodologies is, at the end of a predictive project, the customer is going to get a bridge, okay, that's open and ready for traffic to flow against. In an adaptive project, the customer is going to get a bite of a cupcake, okay, at the end of the, and then he's going to get half of a cupcake, and then he's going to get 3/4 of a cupcake, and he's going to get the whole cupcake, and then he's going to get a box of cupcakes, and then he's going to get a fully blown cake. So it just keeps, with each iteration, you get more and more and more. So, and once again, I think it's driven by the customer, and they are driven by the market, by their funding, by the demand, the business demands they have on them. So it's you got to keep going back to, especially in adaptive projects, the customer has a much stronger position during the execution of an adaptive project than they do in a predictive project. You got to keep the customer satisfied and keep them informed and make sure that they're satisfied with the progress in a predictive project. But the customer is really or the product owner, who is the customer's representative. But one of those two individuals are driving the train in an adaptive environment, and you got to listen to them. It's all back to one of the manifesto highlights of Agile is customer collaboration. So and that's a highly valued. So that's what you want to focus on. Let your customer drive what you're doing.
I love that. I think that's that shows the flexibility of the framework and how you can adapt with that early feedback. So the customer says something, hey man, I like this, or if you did this would be real nice. Yep. Right? Now let's change it, right? You didn't want vanilla frosting? Great, let's put chocolate on there. Yeah. We've only given you one cupcake out of the dozen, so it's not a big deal, right? We'll change the other 11. You'll have a party. Right. Risk mitigation, I think, is there too. It's because you can, as you're delivering, you're triggering risks all the time, right? So you get to see them.
Exactly. And that's why you want to balance risk and value. That's why you have your iteration backlog, and then you have a risk-based iteration backlog, which takes changes the priorities that you're working on based on the risk and what your once again your customer's appetite for risk. If they don't have a very high appetite for risk, then you try to mitigate all the risk as much as you can, or get them to the least amount of negative impact that you can. Whereas if they're prone to have a higher appetite for risk and value is more important to them, then you focus on the value and not so much on the risk. But you always, it's, risk and value are the yin and yang of adaptive projects, and they're completely connected systems. So when one goes up, the other one goes down, and one goes down, the other one goes up. So, but as a good project manager or a practitioner of good project management methodologies, you need to focus on risk and value. So,
yeah, I agree 100%. I also think one of the other pros before we jump into some cons is learning, right? You as an organization, you set up a system of continuous improvement when you do adaptive projects, because of those ceremonies like the retro. How do we do this better? Mm-hmm. Because of the review where you're getting the customers all in the room, getting the team in the room, and you're showing them the product, right? You're learning, you're setting a culture of, hey guys, just because we planned it this way does not mean that's how we're going to do it on the next sprint, right? We always are willing to change. We embrace change, right, over the plan. So I think that's important.
And I think the flexibility of adaptive type methodologies is obvious when exactly what we're talking about right here. You may be executing a project under Scrum and with a Scrum, but you still import principles from Lean in order to do continuous improvement. So you pick a methodology within the Agile family of methodologies. It's not mutually exclusive of other ones. You may be doing a Scrum, but decide that you want to use an XP principle and have paired programming. Paired developers working together. There's, that to me just shows the flexibility and the benefit of agile methodologies, in that it's like a la carte, pick and choose the things that work, as long as you're focused on delivering quality to your customer and executing the project as efficiently and effectively as you can. You've got this huge menu that you can select from, what works best in the environment and the context of your project. So
I agree. I couldn't agree more. I think that's spot on. And then as we move to like the cons, like what are some of the bad things that come with iterations? One thing I can think of is, I guess the overhead and the coordination, right? So you have to coordinate iterations. Whereas if you can do a predictive plan from start to end, mm-hmm. all the planning was done up front, it was batched, and now just go ka-chung, 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 right? Go execute. Whereas iterations, you put the plan for them, right? You have to put in time for them. And each one of them is a cost. It's a man-hour thing. So I'm curious to see what you think on the cons of iterations.
One of the cons that I've experienced myself is that when you commit to using an adaptive type of methodology, then you have stakeholders that want detailed planning, even though you've tried to educate them and the organization about how adaptive is different than predictive. And especially if it's an organization that is used to doing predictive projects and is now transitioning or trying to adopt adaptive methodologies. The stakeholders may be used to seeing a formalized plan and can see into the future and know what to expect. And whereas in an adaptive, one of the cons is, hey, we're not looking that far down the road. Okay, we're if you picture a predictive environment, that once you get the plan in place, you're on a straight road. You go right down the road. Where in an adaptive methodology, the road's twisting and turning and the switch bikes, and you can only see up to the next curve. And that's the end of the iteration. You do the iteration review, the iteration retrospective, and then boom, then you do the next iteration planning session, and then do the work, and you can only see to the next curve in the road. So it's that can be a con as far as not being able to see further into the future as far as the plan is concerned, until you educate your stakeholders within the organization that, hey, no, this is a different way of executing this project. And it's I'm happy to see that you're interested in looking that far down the road, but right now it's just not necessary. The way we're executing this project, it's not necessary to have that level of planning at this point in time. But rest assured, it's coming. It will come. You will see that in the future, but we're not going to do it until just before we get to that iteration that involves that work.
Yeah, you bring up two really good points. Is, just as you said, that is, it makes it a challenge to estimate, right, each iteration, because you don't know, right? You don't know what you don't know until you get into it. And then, because it's not planned out, how do you put dollar signs to it? I mean, you may work it in a burn down chart or a burn up chart or something like that, but ultimately the planning is a little bit lighter, so the estimating is going to be lighter. Stakeholders might not be comfortable with that, when they're used to seeing a milestone chart and a Gantt chart, and they know exactly when this activity is going to be done. I mean, as long as there's not slip, right? Because no plan survives first contact with the enemy. But that really pinged on me when you said what you said, like with the whole stakeholder thing. I think that's a challenge estimating wise. I think it's another challenge bringing stakeholders and keeping them engaged with this project, because the only way adaptive projects that really work is if customers and stakeholders stay close to it and be a part of those ceremonies. So that's a big risk in my opinion.
They've got to be a pig and not a chicken in the ham and egg sandwich scenario. So exactly. And you, as a project management practitioner, you have to focus on getting those stakeholders engaged, and you have to spend time with them, and you have to explain to them what's the difference between being interested and being engaged. And like I said, the greatest thing is to just tell them, hey, it's a ham and egg sandwich. Okay. The chicken's involved, the pig's committed, and I'm looking for commitment from you. And I've used that in the past, and it worked. It makes a point in a kickoff meeting when the project sponsor and all the project stakeholders are there. And whenever, a stakeholder looks at you and says, hey, we got all the confidence in the world in your ability to manage this project, and I want to be involved with this project, throughout the entire life cycle of the project, I would always look at them and say, well, thanks. I appreciate that, but I would much rather you be committed to this project than to simply be involved. And then they look at you sort of whimsically and they go, well, what are you talking about? And then you tell them ham and egg sandwich. The chicken's involved, the pig's committed. I'm looking for commitment is what I need. And and that's my definition of support the team. You want to support the team as a stakeholder. You support the team by committing to this project. So.
Right. Oh, I love it. I mean, it really is a difference, where one's just, hey, got it. I'll be involved as I can be when I can be, but it's not committed to the point where, hey man, the pig is committed. You want a bunch of pigs on your team. Exactly. They've done it. They did the hard work.
Yep.
This next one, as we move to the next topic, it's going to be a bit of a stretch, I think. I'm not sure how it's going to turn out, so bear with us, listeners. We're translating a WBS, a very predictive artifact, right? It's an amazing tool. It's probably one of the most ubiquitously used tools in predictive project management, the work breakdown structure, or the WBS. And then how would we make that into something that we could use in an adaptive iteration? So happy to throw a couple things out there, but if you've kind of got formulated thoughts, Max, I'll let you have it.
I've been thinking about this for the last couple of days. And first of all, let's compare. What are we trying to compare? In a predictive methodology, the WBS is the complete and total description of the work and effort required to successfully complete this project. That, by definition, is the work breakdown structure. Whereas what we're comparing it to is basically the product backlog and the iteration backlog in an adaptive environment. Whereas because of the nature of adaptive projects and the changes that are expected and invited and deal with the iteration and the product backlogs are made up of user stories, which are similar to the task in a WBS. But the difference is the task in a WBS are well defined and they're rigid. User stories in an adaptive environment are negotiable and subject to change, and they do as the project is executed. So what you wind up with, you're comparing a WBS is a stone. A iteration backlog or a product backlog is a box of sand, because it can change. You can change the shape. You can pour some out. You can add some more in. But the bottom line is, a WBS fully and completely defines all the work and effort and task associated with the project, whereas the backlog, whether it's the product backlog or the iteration backlog, are always going to be incomplete. It's not necessary for them to be complete, because you're going to continue doing iterations until you reach the definition of done, or the customer says, okay, this is enough. Got it. Thank you. So the difference between the scope, basically, of an adaptive project and a predictive comes down to the difference between a WBS and a backlog, or a backlog / user story. So that's because in my mind, they're sort of the user stories or the task in a WBS. So.
Oh, wow. I don't know that I could explain that nearly as well. So I do appreciate the word pictures. I love the analogy of a stone, right? It's almost like the tablets from Moses, right? They're chiseled.
Exactly.
We don't embrace change on our WBS because we've already decided that through the SMEs, through all our planning, that this is what we're doing. And we've captured 100% of the work. The sand, a great analogy, right? We can always pour a little bit more in. We can scrape some out if it didn't work, change it up, change the form.
A hole in the middle of exactly. Push some to the side, pile it up in the middle. It's malleable. You can change it. So.
Great word. I think ultimately, like if you were going to go through stages of planning, you could take an iteration and say, okay, guys, we're going to plan this project. We're going to deliver a little project. Then we're going to inspect it. And then we'll probably end up running out of time for that iteration. And then we go to iteration 2. Mm-hmm. Hey, we already did most of the planning in iteration 1. Let's go back, do a little bit more, inspect a little bit more, and then get into the maintenance side of things. Did we do our tech writing? Did we, so you could, with the WBS, you could essentially take and break them down into, planning, analysis, design, testing, and then, deployment could be a whole nother iteration. So it's not that it's not doable. It's just, it's an apple and an orange comparison. They're so very different. It's a difficult task, but I think if you break it down and say, hey, it's more like my schedule than it is my WBS, where I'm just going to say, I'm going to take these activities, put it into this iteration, and then I'm going to go do a little bit of what I didn't get done in the next iteration. You might be able to help convert your WBS into something adaptive. If in case, why would you ever do this, right? If your company decided that, hey, we're going adaptive, guys, make it happen, but you're only used to doing WBSs. So
exactly. And that's all part of your project planning analysis up front, as far as if you're directed as to what methodology to use, then hey, that's it. That's what the boss said. But if you're in an organization that has traditionally done predictive, but is now embraced adaptive methodologies, they're going to look to you. That organization is going to look to you as a and I'm trying to avoid using the word professional project manager, because in adaptive we don't have project managers, but we have professional project practitioners, okay, that are experienced. But the organization is going to expect you to do an analysis with the team, probably, about, okay, guys, how should we approach this? I mean, is it and you start off with how complex is this? Is if it's the greater the complexity, the more you tend to lean toward an adaptive sort of solution. And then look at the scope. If the scope is certain, then you start leaning toward the predictive way. But if you wind up in a situation that is a complex situation with a lot of uncertainty with regard to scope, then that, to me, that's funneling down. That cone is coming down to, hey, this should be an adaptive sort of approach. If you don't want to waste a lot of money, if you don't want to take a lot of risk, then this is the way to approach this.
Agreed. I think it's really great. And, we talked a little bit about it, like even on the backlog. You've said it during a couple of the other sections that we've talked about before, is, scope, right? What are we doing? Is it fuzzy? Is it clear? Do we have a lot of information? Have we done this before, right? A lot of different decisions to determine which form you're going to use. But what are some good inputs for that scope? Like, what do you use primarily to determine the scope of the project when you're handed a project?
Well, it depends on the level of requirements you're given. I mean, if a customer says, hey, I want you to put a bridge over the River Kwai at this location, and that's the end of the requirements, then you got a lot of work to do to develop the scope. If an owner, though, or a customer comes to you and says, look, I want a bridge across this river at this location. I want it to be a double steel tower suspension bridge. I need it to have 8 lanes of traffic and a pedestrian lane, and let's put a bike lane in it also. And I want it to be a concrete deck instead of asphalt. And get that level of requirements. I mean, that's what generates the scope of the project. And I had a great experience in this just right after I retired from the Navy. A program that I had worked in for 5 years, they were radically changing the program's equipment support. They were going from a manned system to an unmanned system. And in order to support the new unmanned system, they needed a facility, an upland facility away from the pier where they could take this equipment and disassemble it and do maintenance on stuff like that. But it had never been done before. So they needed a requirements document to go through to start with the planning and the scope development. So they hired me as a contractor because I had just spent 5 years being the program sponsor, basically, for this program, to go in. I knew all the stakeholders. I knew who all the players were. To go in and sit down and conduct interviews and talk to people and develop the requirements for. I wasn't asked to design the building or to even define the scope of the project from a contractual standpoint. I was asked to just put together the requirements document, and that's exactly what I used. Several different types of techniques, most of which were just one-on-one interviews and group brainstorming sessions. Again, I say, okay, guys, let's talk about, when today with the manned system, when we come back from sea, this is what we do as far as breaking it down, transport. Okay, now we have to imagine. We don't know what this unmanned system is going to be, but we do know we got to get it out of the submarine. We got to get it transported up to the facility. We got to offload it off the transportation, whether it's a rail transport, whether it's a truck transport, whatever. We got to get it off the transport system, and then within the facility, we got to be able to move this thing around. At the beginning, the equipment's going to weigh 16,000 pounds, but then as we disassemble it and when you get down to the very end of the building, the component weights are only going to be about 2,000 or 3,000 pounds. So therefore, we don't need the same crane system all throughout the building. We can save money by having a modulated crane lifting system throughout the building. Start at when you've got the assembled component. Yes, you need the full capacity of the lifting equipment, but when you're down at the component level, you don't need it. You can go to a much smaller crane, which is much less expensive. Typically, it's faster. And I sat down. It took me a year to write up and to come up with this. Now, the requirements document turned out to be, a couple of 100 pages thick, but then that became the basis that they gave to an architect and engineering firm to develop the scope of the facility that they were going to design this facility and build this facility. So it all comes down. It starts with the requirements, and the more requirements you have and the better defined they are, the easier it is to develop the scope. But if you're not given a lot of requirements and just told to go do something, what you're going to find out is you're going to be in a change-rich environment, because the customer may tell you, "Hey, I just need you to be able to move this piece of equipment from A to B." And okay, so you design something that will move it from A to B very efficiently. And then he goes, "Oh, but it's got to be able to lift this amount of weight in this amount of time, and to do it with a certain amount of certainty, and all these other." And it's like, well, those are requirements that it's much more than the scope of being able to lift a piece of equipment. You got a lot of details in lifting that piece of equipment, and that's how you generate comprehensive, complete scope statements, is by starting with comprehensive component requirements, and you build up. So
what a great example. Like, I love it in the story. So let's just kind of break down some of the things that you probably saw when you were doing that over the year time frame. You probably saw a business case of some sort that said, "Hey, we want to convert to unmanned," right? And here's the business value, right? There's something in there. So now you kind of have the why, right? And there's probably some kind of a project charter, maybe not a formulated one up front, but it could have been in the sense of, "Hey, Max, we want you to do this. This is your contract," right? Which very well could have been your project charter. I need to go build these requirements.
It was a directive from DOD level that said, get the man out of the loop. It was a safety issue as far as getting the man out of the loop, because you're subjecting the sailors and these divers to risk, physical risk, when you're doing this. Well, you break a piece of equipment or you lose a piece of equipment, it's going to hurt your mission, and it's going to cost you some money and cost you some time, but nobody's got to write a letter to the next of kin.
That's right.
So that was the driving factor, was to get the man out of the loop.
Yeah, right. Man, wow. So, I mean, in your case, you didn't have like historical project data to go look at, right?
No, and the equipment hadn't even been developed yet. We truly had to imagine and to base. But I was pleasantly surprised that these old hairy-chested, bare-knuckled deep-sea divers who had been doing this their whole career could sit down around a table and talk about the future that didn't include them. We basically put ourselves, the guys that had been doing this for many years, we were asked to come up with a solution to put ourselves out of business,
right?
And to progress to the next level. And
yeah, too cool. I mean, that's expert judgment right there, right? If you're bringing into the PMBOK and saying, "Hey, listen, what do we use to create scope?" You guys had it all. I mean, you have the expert judgment, you had constraints and assumptions, because you kind of knew here's the problem set. How do we lift heavy equipment? The assumption is there's going to be some people that are probably pissed off they're losing their job and livelihood, because there's some pride there, So, I mean, that would be, there could be a chance for misinformation or bad information, or just reluctant to be a part of it. So I think that's really an interesting story that we get to talk about on this show and kind of show you all these little inputs that create one, and you said it, your scope statement.
Mm-hmm.
And that helps determine the overall project scope as well. So how cool.
It's, you know, the opportunity to put the subject matter experts together. It was easy for me to find people who had decades of experience of taking equipment to sea, deep ocean engineering equipment to sea, and using it and lowering it to the seafloor and operating and raising it back up to the surface and recovering on board a ship. And so, and it was all great. And they could sit around and they could spend days telling you how to do it. Exactly. This is what you need to do. But then you come up with, okay, great, but we got to put this in a submarine. And then and everybody goes, oh, what do you mean you got to put? Yeah, it's got to go inside a submarine.
Wow.
Oh, well, so back away from all this equipment that you're used to using and just think about how it worked. And the whole, cable goes out, cable comes in, cable gets level wind on the drum of the winch. But it can't be this, 20-foot high winch that sits on the back of an open deck of an offshore work vessel. This has got to fit somewhere, somehow, in a compartment of a submarine. And you got to put it in there. Someday you're gonna have to take it out. You're gonna have to work on it. You got to maintain it. You got to change a cable on it. How are you going to get this 10,000 feet of cable off this winch drum and replace it on a regular basis?
Right. Talk about
it really changes the approach. But once again, it comes back to, we're trying to develop the scope of this project. And before we get carried away with how much we know about the scope, or even how much we don't know about it, we got to take one step back and say, okay, let's break the scope down into actual individual requirements. Okay. And then we can take the requirements and group them together to create logical scope. But it's hard to do it the other way around without taking a lot of time, a lot of consideration. And and it was just this year that I spent, the biggest frustration was, no matter how much thought I put into who's the right person to have in the room for this discussion, and how many discussions I had with other people about who is the right people, who are the right people, and make sure we got them. We inevitably would get in and start the discussion. And before we got 2 hours into it, we realized there was someone else we needed to have in the discussion. And they may have been on the other side of the country. They might have been on leave. They usually were not available. And then you had to, figure out, it was a huge planning problem, trying to get, 40 to 60 individuals together at different times at the same location to discuss this and focus on it, and be able to carve, 1 or 2 days out of their busy life to sit down and focus on this and talk about it. So,
well,
it worked out just fine.
The travel budget on that one must have been.
Help.
But now, okay, last question, and before we move to the next topic of because I think that dovetails perfectly with project tracking, is how did you maintain change control on that? Because I'm sure as you learned more with these requirements, it was like, oh, well, we got to go back to requirement number 1 because this is completely different.
Well, the approach that we took was that we weren't concerned about changes in the requirements together. All we want to do was list all the requirements and make sure we covered everything, even requirements that were, once the program progressed, were determined to be, no, this is not a requirement, and so we can take it out. But our approach was, let's give them a list of requirements that can be whittled down to what they think is the proper scope of the project. But let's ensure that we don't leave anything out of a requirement that then becomes a change. It's like, oh, you guys didn't include this. Now you want to include it. Well, then that affects this, and it's going to affect this, and it's going to affect this. So now you've got this huge change. So the approach we took was, hey, let's put everything, including the kitchen sink, in this, and then let the people who are making the decision about the scope of the project, let them, yes, 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 no, no, maybe, yes, yes, no, and then do away with all the no's, and then reconsider all the maybes, and then you're left with all the yeses, and then take that list of requirements, and turn them into the scope of the project.
Perfect. Yeah, much better to have too many requirements than not enough. I like that.
Yep.
And
It's an old saying, it's better to have it, not need it, than to need it, not have it. So.
Yeah, exactly. Unless you're the Army guy rucking it out.
Yeah, well, exactly. It all needs to be way less than 40 pounds and fit on your back. So
that's right. Nobody likes to retrograde anything.
Yeah.
But as you talk about this, I mean, it starts to really work on the thought process of how do we track it? Like, how are we tracking adaptive projects, and then compare that to how do we track plan-based? I think on the plan-based, we can start there because that's a little bit easier, and your story just really kind of plays well with that. So just talk to me a little bit about the difference between that predictive and the adaptive project tracking.
Well, I think the approach of predictive is to allow you to track to two things: plan and track. And that phase of the project that we call monitoring, controlling, that's where you discover whether or not you did adequate planning, and whether or not the plans that you developed, all your project management plan, all those sub management plans that are in your project management plan, you discover how effective and efficient they are when you're monitoring and controlling, which is the tracking part of it. When you flip over, when you find yourself in the adaptive environment, the good news is the tracking becomes a lot less cumbersome, because you're focused at the iteration level, which is 1 week, 2 week, 30 days at the most. And so and at the beginning of that, you only got one day, 8 hours to do your iteration planning, whereas half that time is when the product owner is going to be explaining to you about what this product is, what the functionality is, what we want to do, and how it is. And then then you get 4 hours in the afternoon for the team to plan. Okay, this is what we're willing to commit to during this iteration, and this is what we can do. We develop the user stories. We assign story points to each one so that we make sure that we're not going to violate. We know what our team's velocity is. And so we want to make sure that we develop story points so that we easily add them up and say, okay, and look and say, okay, we're not going to violate exceeding our velocity, our team velocity during this iteration. And then you approach it with the fact that, okay, we're time bound. We got whatever the iteration time is to work on this. We've committed this. If things don't get done, you simply hand those back to the product owner. They add them, they put them back on the product backlog, and then groom the product backlog and decide, okay, what is the priority of this feature? Where does it go? And so it's like I said, in my mind, it's just that the tracking in adaptive projects is just simpler, because the time period that you're tracking over is much shorter. On a predictive project, you're tracking the entire project life cycle, the entire project, that you're executing and monitoring and controlling. That's what you're tracking. Whereas in adaptive, you're only tracking for the next week or 2 weeks or 30 days. And then the good news is you get to stop, you get to look at how well you did it. You get to talk with the team about what worked and what didn't work and how we can improve it. And then you make what changes are necessary. And then you get another 30 days to do it all over again. And then, continuously improve. And so it's just simpler in my mind to track it in an adaptive environment, to track the progress of the project.
All right. Yeah. I like it. I like when I read it and I was thinking about it, you know, a lot of times like when we talk about adaptive tracking, it's, you know, you got the burn up, burn down charts, you've got a couple other different like velocity. You mentioned that. So I think that's important. Story points, you brought that up. And I always thought too, like you're looking at your backlog and that can always change. So it's hard to track that. But you can always tell what you did during a sprint. You said it, that was your velocity and how many story points did you finish up. And then you get to the really to the review. And in my mind, that was the sense of the tracking is when I delivered this to the customer and they took it and said, yep, this is what I was talking about. Or nope.
This is on the right approach. You're on the right path. You're going right down the right path. This is right. You took a good step.
That's right. And the product owner should immediately be like, okay, boom, this one's validated. Let's go. Change it over to a predictive, right? Now and you said it earlier, you planned it, you executed it. Now monitoring, controlling, you're looking at, hey, quality. All right. Did what I produce really match the requirement that stakeholder through my requirements traceability matrix? I go in there and say, okay, this stakeholder said, I want the birdhouse to be white. Okay, great. Is it the right shade of white? Because there's, you know, from eggshell all the way to brilliant white. And you hand that to them and you say, hey, boss, is this the white you're talking about? You know, through, you know, scope validation and then acceptance. So I feel like that's some tracking as well when you're talking about the increments of the project or the iterations of a predictive project. So I think everything you said is correct. In my mind, I was thinking to myself, it's also got to be where the product hits the customer. Like, where does that touch point? Are you taking it? Do you want to take it? Do you not want to take it? And then as we watch our plan progress through our, like, whatever chart, schedule, activity list, however you map through it, in my mind, it was almost easier to track a predictive because you can say on this point of a calendar, I'm here. Right.
Because you got a schedule, you got a budget, you've got all these formalized plans that you put into place and relating to scope, schedule, and budget. And you're tracking it as you go. Where in a adaptive environment, you've only got 2 weeks worth of scope or 30 days worth of scope to look at. Now you can track it within that 30-day period. But like I said, to me, it's a whole lot simpler to track something over 30 days than it is to track it over 5 years.
Yeah, good point.
And you get much more instantaneous feedback. I mean, the point you made about delivering something to the customer, you hand it to the customer and you get feedback. You know, the initial feedback is, what was the look on the guy's face when you handed it to him? You know, did he seem excited? You know, was his chin going up and down, or was he shaking his head side to side? You know, you get all that feedback from the customer, which then is a feedback loop into your tracking system. Okay, you know, I thought I was doing all the right thing, doing it the right way, and now I see that I was off a little. I need to adjust a little bit, and then, you know, before I fire for effect. And so yeah, I think that's how the two, you can compare the two.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a good point to make too is, like, on the backlog, they can always take and pour more stuff in there.
Mm-hmm.
I want
Exactly.
this. You don't have an end date. You really don't have an end to your project until the backlog is completely done and all the features of the product are completely accepted. Like, it's just an ongoing project.
Right. And to think that a user or a customer, no matter how much what they may have initially on the product backlog, to think that that's not got more things are not going to be, as you go and as you produce something, you hand it to them, you're going to spur thoughts in the customer's mind. Oh yeah, this is really great. And no, I didn't think about this, but what about doing this now? And we can add this, or we could do this. We could paint it this color. We could stripe it. We could do all this other stuff. And so that just gets added to the product backlog, and it just keep going. And I'm actually curious on some of these big projects to figure out when would you ever stop? Like, for example, iPhones. What's the end of iPhones. 147 years from now, are we going to be at iPhone 111? Or, I mean, where is the end of iPhone? And the answer is probably never, because technology is going to continue to change. Apple has proven that they are able to take useful technology and adapt it and install it and integrate it into their telephone and deliver it to their customer for about $1,000.
Yeah.
and that's every year or every whatever release period they have to come out with a new iPhone. It comes out with some new whiz bang. Oh, the camera's much better. Oh, you got this feature you didn't have before. So there's something always in, and it costs about $1,000. And because their market research has determined that people are willing to pay about $1,000 for a telephone that's got all these bells and whistles and smartphone that can do all these things, and you can live your life by your phone. The average person around the world is willing to pay about $1,000 for it. And so that's what they focus on. So.
Yeah, you're not wrong. I think that's a really great example of like product management, right? Mm-hmm. They're really good product managers to where they have a release cycle, which, wow, that's exactly the stuff we're talking about right here. So they're building market research and getting analysis from their customers, and it's saying, hey, what features do you like? We're going to roll that feature into the next one, right? So I mean, it's a beautiful example of how this adaptive framework works in a very successful company.
And I find it a coincidence, I guess, that the release dates of new iPhones are tied almost directly to the battery life of the previous iPhone. So once you've charged and discharged and gone through all the charging cycles of your battery, and you get to the point that your phone is just not that functional anymore because you can't keep the battery charged, you can take it into an Apple store and they can change the battery there, but they're not going to do it while you're standing there. They're going to have to take it and send it off somewhere. So if you're willing to do without your phone for a couple of weeks, we can put a new battery in it, which, by the way, is probably going to cost about $500 or $600. Or you can buy a new iPhone 14, our newest release, that has a brand new battery in it and all these additional features for about $1,000.
Yeah, and a camera you couldn't have lived without.
Exactly. And I think if you're in your 20s today, if you're smart enough to develop a budget to live off of, a financial budget, you just need to add into your family budget that everybody gets a new phone for about $1,000 every year, or maybe 16, 18 months. But you just need to build that into your family budget, because no one can live without a phone. No one can function without an iPhone or a smartphone.
Right. Right on. Wow. As we start to wrap this up, I think we covered a lot of ground, but I think it was fairly logical when we talked about units of iterations. And then we swapped over to the pros and cons of adaptive versus predictive and threw a couple of examples out there. And then we translated a WBS into not really a backlog, not really a couple of things here or there, but different cycles within an adaptive iteration, and then inputs for scope. Your story about the underwater transition from manned to unmanned, I think that really tied that together. And then as we talked about the importance of project tracking, both adaptive and predictive, I think we hit on a lot of different topics, but they all kind of gelled together nicely towards the end. Last parting shot, and then we'll wrap it up.
It's just you're never going to run out of realizing that you need to spend time thinking about when you're trying to compare predictive to adaptive methodologies. And that's a good thing if you're a project professional. Okay, you need to be constantly analyzing, okay, what's the best approach? What works best for the company? What's the best business result? And those sort of things. And you have to constantly keep, educating yourself and trying different things, running experiments and and seeing what works, and not be, some of the agile principles, are, they talk about, courage. You gotta have courage to try something new. And but it's a good thing. I think it's a very it's an excellent time to be in the project management profession. It's exciting times. Things are happening within the industry. People are no longer accepting the fact that you put a construction contract out for bid and you get a price for $7 million. Companies aren't that willing to just accept that and write a check or enter into a contract. They want analysis done on this, and the analysis should start with, number one, are they meeting all the requirements? And then, how are they developing that into the scope? And then how does the scope translate to the schedule and budget? And then how are we going to deal with risk? And how are we going to ensure quality? And all these things about project management. And the companies are growing more sophisticated in learning, appreciating the value of good project management, in that people who are educated and experienced in project management can add a lot of value to the organization by shepherding them through this time when they're trying to make these decisions about, hey, is this, should we just accept this bid for $7 million, or we got, even though we may have some competitive bids, are all about the same price, or is this really what we're trying to get to? And so it's an interesting time. And if you're going to be a project manager, you need to spend time and make sure that you're staying up to speed with the developments of project management methodologies, and constantly think about how to apply and what's applicable and what's not applicable, and to do that. So
I couldn't agree more. And I think something you said, just really, it's super important to know the benefits, the trade-offs of both methodologies, so that you can employ the appropriate one for the appropriate project, or a hybrid scenario. I think that a lot of projects would benefit from a hybrid project approach. Different tools and techniques are best.
I agree. Like I said, I executed hybrid projects and didn't realize, I thought I was executing a predictive project, but I was using aspects and techniques and tools of adaptive methodology within my predictive environment, and it worked just well. They added a lot of value to the project. And so that's why I think it's such a good time to be in project management right now. And you need to learn both adaptive, hybrid, and predictive methodologies, so that you, as the professional, can make the proper recommendation to your organization about how we should approach this, and constantly educate the organization on the different methodologies and the pros of some and the cons of the others, and then so that they, number one, what that's going to do is the senior management of the organization is going to develop a trust in you as a project professional, that, hey, this guy really knows what he's talking about, and he knows how to do what we need him to do, and most importantly, he knows how to do things that we're not asking him to do, but yet he's bringing those things to the table. So I think that's why this is a great time for people to be, embarking on careers in project management.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Well, thanks so much for your time, Max. And
thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. So
absolutely. And we'll see you next time.
All right.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the PM Pathfinder series and want to join the profession, certify, or maintain your PDUs by visiting vets2pm.com and looking up Project Manager Essential Toolbox or a bootcamp.